Wow. Exciting. I think I say that every day. Exciting.
Kim, I think it's 9 o'clock right now, and people is keep coming in, but I think we just honor those who come in early, and maybe we can start a little bit of a brief introduction right now, and then we can gradually start after several minutes. Is that all right?
Beautiful.
Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Jenny from the Hong Kong Sensory Integration Society, and welcome you all to join us in this Sleep Matters, first time of our online video Zoom call. And this is the first time of us to host an online call. So please pardon us for any inconvenience in all the procedures and the delay. And we are trying to make our best to have this course happen. And today we have invited Kim. Kim Bevell is from Canada. So she is now in Vancouver, her home, and joining us in this amazing course of Sleep Matters. And at this time, why we are inviting Kim is because that we saw a lot of people have sleeping issues in our daily practice, especially clients from mental health aspects and also from pediatric or psychiatric or adults, all kind of clients. And we also see sleeping problem. And sometimes it's accompanied with some digestive issues or some physical illness or discomfort. And there are a lot of impact in their self-care and work and also leisure. So it's quite an OT domain, but we seldom have people talking into this area. And we are very interested in what we can do as an OT to understand more of the background and the rationale and on how to support these kind of clients. And also our friends and family have those with sleeping issues. And I think we all know Kim's, and Kim is a Canadian OT. So I didn't spend much time in introducing her. She is quite well known among the world, and she has been joining us for some times now. So I just pass the time to Kim, and then we can talk a bit later. But first of all, we need to introduce a little bit of the ground rules. So later on, maybe all of our participants, please try to mute yourself first so that we won't interrupt Kim's talk. And if you have any question, we encourage you to raise your question in the chat box, and we will check it from time to time. And if you have really something want to feedback, you can unmute yourself and then comment to certain question and answer that Kim's making. Okay. So if there is nothing else, then we can pass the time to Kim. Welcome, Kim.
Wow. How exciting. I'm in Hong Kong this morning. It's so awesome to see your beautiful faces and names. No, I'm not on mute.
Okay, good.
Thank you. I wanted to begin by introducing Bobbin Spenceley, who is my Relationship Matters team colleague. And he is going to give you a little bit of an understanding of sort of the format for this morning. Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Kim. Welcome, everyone. It's a huge honor to be with you all. I see people from Australia, a lot from Hong Kong. And if anyone's from a different place, feel free to just pop into the chat right now where you're from. I know you're all occupational therapists, but where are you all based? And we're aiming for the session to be interactive. So any question is good. Chances are, if you have a question, that means other people will have the same question. And if you have the courage to ask it out loud, that will encourage other people to participate too. So one thing to say, if you're new to Zoom, up in the top right corner, there's a button that has to do with how you view, whether it's gallery view or speaker view. And you can have a totally different experience depending on if you want to look at Kim or if you actually want to look at all the other participants. It's your choice, but I'll give you some comfort. in the recording, I'm only recording the speaker. So I will not be recording the whole gallery. So if anyone wants to go to sleep, pardon the pun, you won't be caught on camera. So I'll pass it over to you, Kim. But again, from the traditional territory of the Woo-Saanich and Coast Salish First Nation people in our corner of Victoria, BC, Canada, welcome to this really very interesting session. And I want to let you know, all of this is new for us. This whole topic of sleep that was really invented by Jenny and the Hong Kong Sensory Integration Society. When they asked us to put it together, Kim said, that's a really smart idea because sleep impacts everything. And it really is a pretty fascinating process to watch Kim buy a lot of books and read all the time, night and day. So let's fasten your seatbelts. This will be.
Oh, that's funny. Well, you had a chance to have the view of the two sessions. And today's intention is to have the opportunity to have a conversation. So not everyone is comfortable with having their camera on. But I want to tell you, I have you up here on a 47-inch screen so that I feel like I'm with you. And that's the joy of this platform. I want to speak about what it's been like to teach in this way for the past 6 months. One thing that I do want to start out by saying to all of you is, as we become more familiar with the use of this technology, I wanted to apologize if this Zoom is new to you. I have a confession in that we, on our team, we're on here 7-8 hours a day, and it's actually like dialing a telephone. So I apologize for anyone who's feeling a little bit uncertain or had a little bit of challenge at the beginning. What I'm going to do to give us some structure is I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint, and we're going to open up the conversation to questions related to the material. But I wanted to give you a starting place rather than just saying, do you have any questions? Because that sometimes feels a little bit too big. And I want to remind you, like I do every group, try really hard for this session not to let your mind go to the curiosity of what do I do. See if you can stay with the science and the information around the different sleep issues across the lifespan, and really try and hold on from going into solution mode. And you can guess why I say that. It's because it happens to me every single day, where there's this urge in our profession to want to get to that place right now. But the information from this last set, when you get to see what's coming to you next week, you'll see why. How you choose what you choose depends so significantly on the different complexities of the issues that you see in front of you.
And we had an idea, I think, that is a little bit revolutionary, in that just before the end, maybe 10 minutes before our hours are up, I'm going to write in the chat, I might say it out loud, hey, if you have any questions about what do I do about sleep, for solutions, for interventions, write them in the chat, because Kim is still putting together the PowerPoint for those sessions. We can make sure that every one of your questions gets answered in the next 2 sessions. So it's kind of a really tailor-made workshop in that respect. Honestly, ask anything and we'll do our best to answer.
All righty. So I'm just curious if you could start by writing in the chat what your what it was, if you felt as overwhelmed by this information as I did. I'm curious. Yes. Thank you, Lisa. The information is completely overwhelming. These first 2 lectures took me 6.5 months of research to be able to compile it in this way. And I feel like I scratched the surface. This could be a person's life's work. As a matter of fact, it is some people's life's work. So my office has been covered with papers around sleep for the many months in trying to deeply understand what's going on in a 2020 knowledge base of the science of sleep. So if the information when you listen to me made you go, oh my gosh, that's okay. That's why it's really cool to be able to watch it again and again and again, which is so different than if I was standing there throwing it up on you in one shot in a lecture form. So let's start and just go through here and give you the opportunity. Please jump in the chat or unmute with a question around each concept as it comes up for you. One of the most interesting things for me about the relevance of sleep was the power of the immune system when we sleep. This was the biggest light bulb for me about how all of the repair, restore, reorganization happens when we sleep, and how critical that function is for our everyday well-being. The other thing that is fascinating to me is how the brain catalogs, organizes, and integrates information from the day while you sleep. That all the learning, I don't know about you, but I used to cram for exams. I think many of us did. And that we now know is the worst way to remember information. That the most powerful way to organize the information that you're taking in is to actually stop thinking about it. Isn't that wow? That you need to turn the brain off in order for you to file it in a categorical, in a nice organized way. When the lights go out, the brain starts to work. I love that statement. You learned that there are different stages to sleep, and that these different stages have completely different functions and completely different mechanisms. So when you think about why is this happening and how did this get organized this way? The mystery of our human biology created these different transitions when we think about how much of our life we spend sleeping. This is really about living. Sleeping is how we actually live. So talk about human occupation. If you can't sleep, you can't function. So in my mind, as I was reading and learning, I thought every OT in the world needs to understand this information. One of the interesting pieces here is there's a phase that happens when we are just falling asleep. And you know that place. You're not quite sleeping, but you're not quite awake. And your brain is starting to relax. And the brainwave activity changes, goes from alert and engaged and moving into a downward, slower pace. We call that beta wave. But what's interesting about beta wave is this is where sensory processing is very vulnerable. So those of you who are interested in sensory, it's in that beta wave that there is less cortical inhibition, less dampening of information coming in from the environment. This is why so many people have trouble falling asleep, is because in that little time frame of falling asleep, that's when the filtration system of the reticular activating system is the most open for business. And then you are more attuned to the environment around you. So I want you to realize this is why when we get to the next section, which is all about strategies and treatment, the environment in which we sleep is very significant, especially for those who have difficulty falling asleep. Have any of you ever felt like you were going to fall or fly just when you were going to sleep? This is so common, and it happens in this brainwave shift between alpha and beta. It's this downward slope. And that they call them hypnagogic hallucinations. You feel, I've heard people talking to me, or you think there's someone in the house, or my dad just called my name. And these are internal sensory experiences that are arising from within instead of from outside of the brain. Isn't that interesting? So when the brain has less external stimulation, one author I read called it die-off. It's like my internal world is starting to shut down, and it's got to get its digs in there and give me a little bit of information just before I fall asleep.
Kim, there's a question in the chat that I'm also curious about. It's that in-between time of you're a little bit alert, but you're a little bit dreaming. Can you say more about how that process happens?
Well, you know, it's this, how it happens, or how, I think when you ask me the how, my problem with the question how takes me to a physiological place, meaning I interpret that question to mean, well, how do those shifts actually get initiated? Or how do those switches get turned on and off? So, Angus, if that's not what you're asking, you'll have to help me. But the switches, like on the light switch, those are neurochemical drivers that have a chain reaction of communication that change the brainwave activity. And a lot of it has to do with the onset of melatonin, which we're going to talk about shortly. And as the melatonin levels rise, it's like the brain gets all the little gates close. And as those gates close, sensations get shut down. It's called the gating process. And then I'm still slightly available. I'm not completely, because I haven't shifted gears sufficiently yet in my consciousness. So I've still got a few gates open. They're not all fully closed. And that's why I still am somewhat alert and yet not quite alert.
So it's not going from white to black. It's like 50 Shades of Grey.
50 Shades of Grey. These are all like continuums of phases that are constantly changing throughout your sleep cycle. And each one of us has a different one. This is what's so interesting, is our own individual rhythms are unique to ourself. So it says here, sometimes I come across the experience of having a dream at a non-REM stage 1 phase. I am still alert at that time. We are actually not really truly yet in non-REM. I just want to say that. If you're still a little bit alert, you're shifting between beta and theta wave. So you can't quite call that full non-REM. You're in the early stages of that continuum. The other thing that happens to some people, and this is true of Bob, when he is in this stage, he has all these little twitches, jerks. His hands do all these things. And as the person sleeping in the bed beside, it's like, oh, a startle. These are called myoclonic jerks. And they are interpreted as very fast shifts into non-REM sleep. So this is a indicator that the person is really good at falling asleep, that in-between phase isn't really a big deal for them.
Yeah, there are very few secrets in our house. If anyone is going to talk about it on a Zoom call, I know this.
Well, I just know this phenomenon very well. And so these myoclonic jerks, they are a discharge of energy in the musculature as you shift into deep sleep.
And there was a request also for non-REM versus REM dreams, which are and which are more contextual.
Well, you know, that's very, very interesting, because REM is very emotional and non-REM is very contextual. So Sarah, you got it right, girl. You got it going on there. And so we used to believe that dreaming, you know, only happened in REM phase. But now that is clear that is not the case, that there is dreaming throughout the night or throughout the sleep phases, because it doesn't have to be at night. I'm thinking about jet lag right now. And these non-REM spaces, which are very deep, there's a lot of concepts and context in those dreams. They're more logical. Whereas the REM ones are vivid, emotional, intense, and we will talk about why in just a moment. The majority of our sleep is deep, non-REM. And there are unusual spikes in the EEG, and they call them sleep spindles. My gosh, the number of papers on sleep spindles would put you to sleep. This is a really, really important microscope that they look at this particular phenomenon. So anybody who ever goes for a sleep study where they wear an EEG during their sleep, they're really looking at these sleep spindles, which are very high spikes in the depth. So they're wide apart, but really high. So they're like mountain climbing. And these particular spikes are indicative of the deepest form of sleep. And this is where we know you're cleaning your brain. So that's why it's so important, is there's been a tremendous amount of connectivity between that very profound depth of sleep, cleaning up your brain, and the formation of short-term memory into long-term memory. So when it's not just, I'm having a non-REM sleep, and that's good enough. They look at the quality in an EEG of these sleep spindles to try to discern, you know, how much depth of sleep you're actually achieving. And this has a relationship to what we're going to talk about when you think about sleep apnea, where you may have a deep sleep, but you don't get quite the same quality of these sleep spindles, which will interfere with the inflammatory processes. It's really an indicator of your health. Was that clear so far? Everybody cool? So just want to move this over for myself a bit here. When you're sleeping deeply, this is when you have neuroplasticity. You release growth hormone. There's cellular repair in your whole body. It is when you do your best learning. Isn't that wild? Your learning becomes most organized. That's where you take your past learning, your in the moment learning, and your future projections, and put them together. So what we call working memory depends on deep sleep. So that makes me think about executive functions. So the individuals that you and I support who experience difficulties with executive functions, they need this quality of sleep to have their best capacity. And that's why we often call, when we see brain injured clients, cortical fatigue. Their executive functions make them exhausted, and there's cortical fatigue because there isn't this quality of organization in the sleep process. When I think about all the neurotransmitters involved, such an important, these are the switches. All these neurotransmitters that are involved in the shifts of phase, these have everything to do with other functions, motor functions, cognitive functions, attention functions, regulatory functions, sensory processing. The same neurotransmitters that you and I care about with respect to other things, this is affected in our sleep. Can you explain a wee bit more the meaning of contextual? Is that the context that happened in the day or the surrounding environmental during sleep? It's more the logical order of events that might happen in your life. You know how you have dreams and they're crazy and you're all over the place? And, you know, 1 minute you're here and then you're there, and that is REM sleep. Whereas contextual is like, went to the grocery store. Bob, you had one this morning. You were telling me about a contextual dream. You were talking about a particular structure for this workshop in your sleep. And that would be an example of a contextual dream.
Can I tell them about it?
Yeah.
So I had this great dream that I had just a bit of confidence, and I walked into the local store. It's called Sleep Country Canada. It's where you buy the best pillows, the best bedding. And I was going to go and interview a guy that's worked there for like 20 years. And every time you walk in to the store, he wants to sell you everything. So I thought I would interview him with my little camera and say, of all the things you've learned about quality of sleep, because we're going to be talking to a global audience, what would you like in 5 minutes? And I was dreaming about this interview that might actually happen tomorrow. But yeah, that was a wild dream.
But that would be an example of a contextual dream because it's logical. And then the alarm went off. And Bob felt like, you know, he was woken out of the deepest sleep. Whereas in those non-REM, or in those REM phases, I'm sorry, you're like on the edge of it would be very easy to wake up. And you'll find out why in a minute. So it says here from Jenny, both non-REM and REM are so important. Is there a healthy range of ratio that is known between non and, yeah, there isn't, because it's individualized to each person's genetics. It's a really interesting question. Just like many of you have heard me say a million times, that there are 237 different types of autism. Right? Many of you have heard me say that there are so many different sites on the DNA that make up what we call autism. There are many, many alleles in the DNA that are part of circadian rhythms. So you have your own genetic signature for sleep. Isn't that interesting? And that's why, I'm just gonna, there we go. I took care of it.
Okay, I just want to actually welcome, a few people have just joined. Welcome to this event. Just a reminder, please keep your mute button on so we don't hear the background noises. But you're more than welcome to take yourself off mute if you want to ask a question or make a comment, and feel free to contribute to the chat anytime. One other option I hadn't mentioned, if you want to ask something anonymously, you can do so. Just send it to me, Bob Spenceley, and I'll ask Kim without saying who it's from.
So the challenge with a sleep study, or you know, one of the things that I have done in the process of this work is bought a few new devices that I'm going to introduce you to. And one of them measures the quality of my sleep. In order to truly understand one's own optimum ratio, you have to measure your own sleep across time. You can only compare yourself to yourself. So that makes it tricky, doesn't it, Jenny? That we're not, I mean, there are, you know, there's a bell curve of normative that we're trying to fit into. But generally speaking, you know, outliers are going to be a problem.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Cool. Now, I love to think about neurotransmitters because they relate, in my mind, to all the things that we know about sensory processing and functioning, the neurobiology of human behavior. And one of the most important neurotransmitters for sleep is serotonin. And serotonin is the neurotransmitter that sits behind the scenes of the creation of your melatonin. And when I talk about all the different problems across the lifespan, serotonin is a big part of the challenge for so many different sleep difficulties. Because in the pineal gland, which, you know, sits between your two eyes right here, they call it the third eye. That's where the serotonin contributes to the production of your melatonin. And you're going to learn, I'm teasing you in session 3, that cherry juice is one of the best sources of melatonin. Drinking raw cherry juice. Yeah. So if your serotonin levels are low, your melatonin levels will be low. Think about autism as an example. Think about depression as an example, where serotonin levels are not easy to access. You will have difficulties with sleep. Now, here's another layer to that. Serotonin is produced in the gut. You have more serotonin in your gut than you do in your head. And the microbiome in your gut, all the bacteria in your gut, is the directorate of how effective you are going to be at producing serotonin. So if you have a planet in here of microbes that are not optimum for your DNA, your microbes take all your serotonin as opposed to you. And this is why diet and gut health is so critical to sleep. And you think about syndromes like Crohn's, colitis, IBS. Right? And me too, Sarah, every client, naturopaths need to be right beside me because they think this way, in this big picture way, at least the ones in my life. So that if the gut is not healthy, the sleep situation will not be as easy to create. Not just because of things like reflux and pain, but because of neurochemicals and neurotransmitters. So now you think about all of our kids who eat there are three things, and they're all carbs. And carbohydrates, they change the microbiology of your gut, which then creates a challenge for you in producing the serotonin for your brain, which then changes the way you make your melatonin. Oh, it's like a vicious cycle.
Kim, there's some questions in the chat that are reminding me of when my brain wasn't working very well about a year ago. I had some meningitis, and if people are going to already hear about what I dream about and what I look like when I'm sleeping, I think I can share that. I had a meningitis thing a year ago, and my brain went really, really slow, and my working memory was almost off the desk. And so the question is, does that mean challenges with working memory are related to lack of thorough cleaning of the brain in sleep? And in case I would have just needed to sleep a lot more?
So remember, this is a clinical case. When you have meningitis, you have inflammation in the brain, in the meninges of the brain. And in order to clean up that inflammatory process, because inflammation, concussion, brain injury, meningitis, those are infections. Those are things that are going to cause, they take up space in the brain. So the functioning of the brain will be altered by the inflammatory process. Well, when do we clean that up? When we sleep, which is what you did for 6 weeks, was fall asleep sitting up. Wake up for 5 minutes, go to sleep for 3 hours, right? So that is what the brain needed to do in order to reorganize and repair itself. Sleep is the best medicine. So Roberto says here, does serotonin directly affect sleep or just affect the melatonin to do this? Both. And Tina's question about SSRIs, can it have a positive impact on melatonin? The answer is yes. Or if they are synthetic, do they not have the same effect? Well, here's the problem with medication. Medication is not selective. So every serotonin receptor in the brain, whether you need it or not, will get it. And so that's why you will have some of the side effects that you might have when you take an SSRI. So we can't target specific brain structures with medication, but sometimes they help. Hopefully that was helpful. My favorite structure. I say that about a lot of structures. I think I just love the brain. Is the brain stem has this reticular activating system, which is the place that OTs need to know so much about because it's all about arousal. And there's this really funky little structure in there called the locus coeruleus. And it's got a lot of, it stains blue when you put in a dye, which is why they call it the blue nucleus. And it is responsible for paying attention to novelty. You got to put that in big words on this page. So you're sleeping and a spider, I'm thinking about Tina and Lisa in Australia, a spider crawls up your arm. Your locus coeruleus is going to immediately eject adrenaline. So you will go from sleep to full on fight, flight, freeze in an eighth of a millisecond. When you are, if that's how we survive. Saber-toothed tiger comes into the cave, an earthquake happens, a tsunami comes, a spider or a snake crawls across our skin. We don't want to keep sleeping. So this structure's job is to notice any change in the environment, and it will send us into full on. Now imagine for just a minute that you have a sensitive brain, that your brain is wired differently and you're not very good at filtering out information. You might interpret this sheets rubbing on your skin to feel like a spider in the bed. You might interpret some sound outside your home as an earthquake, and you will move from dead sleep to full-on fear often. And this is very common in sensitive individuals and in people with chronic trauma because their brain has been sensitized. If your load of adrenaline is high all the time, you will never truly rest because you are always watching for things, even in your sleep. Is this making sense? Am I making sense?
Not only is it making some sense, it's inspiring a lot of questions.
Okay, Okay, you're on mute though.
Not only is this making some sense, but it's inspiring a lot of interesting questions. And some of them are so technical, I have no clue. Like once in a while, I feel like I could answer at least half, but I'll give you an example of a question. I have no clue. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
What does adding supplemental forms of serotonin precursors like 5-HTP with the intent of helping with manufacturing serotonin do to the neurochemistry?
Sometimes it helps and sometimes it doesn't. This is a beautiful question. So 5-HTP, which is the amino acid that helps to make serotonin, you can take it in a supplement form, as you've said. Sometimes it takes hold and sometimes it doesn't. So why doesn't it? Let me back up and not get too excited here because I could go on for hours. Last summer, after Bob was recovering, I hurt myself and ended up in bed for 10 days with a torn tensor fasciae lata. What a nice pair. So I decided to have my genes decoded. So I sent them away to a lab. This is what I do when I'm not feeling well. I study my DNA. And it was fascinating. It still is. So there is a company called Self Decode, and you send away your saliva, and it looks at all of the configurations of your DNA in relationship to different drugs and relationship to different environmental stimuli and toxins. It's a bottomless pit. And one of the things that it said for me, for example, is my manufacturing of serotonin is one of my gifts. I don't have a lot of those, but that's one of them in my DNA. And so what would happen to me is if I took 5-HTP, it would come out in my urine and in my feces unused, because my DNA won't methylize what I don't need. Okay? So methylization is a very big word here, because methylization is how we make things or break things down with our DNA. And so for me, that's not on my list of things that I would need to take. Now, if I am a person whose DNA has really difficulty with that 5-HTP, you might give it to me as a supplement and it'll fall out of me like a sieve, because my cells won't know how to use it. So this is the problem with generic interventions, is that they have to be custom made to the person that you've got, which is complicated.
Wow.
That's the field of functional medicine that is emerging, looking at all these biological functions.
So it's a lot of trial and error, or when it works, it's treatment. When it doesn't work, it's assessment.
Except that, Bobby, it's getting to be much more precise.
Okay, because you can study DNA and the science is getting more specific.
I have to give a shout out to my friend, my buddy, Karen Wong, who really has, we talk about biohacking, and she's given me so much knowledge about all of these thought processes of different ways of thinking about how your own DNA interfaces with the environment. So Karen, I learned a lot of this from you.
And since you're giving a shout out, I just want to say how cool this is that so many of our friends are on these sessions. This is the highlight of our social life. So we're not traveling anymore. So it's nice to see everybody here. I've got a question, Kim.
Yes.
I wondered if the RAS has anything to do with those who struggle with rigidity or not liking anything novel.
It can, yes. But that's a really cool question. Hey, Bobby, do you know, is it fair to tell me who asked that question, or is it private?
I'm going, Sarah.
Okay, because it's a really, really interesting question, Sarah, because the cingulate gyrus is the home of rigidity. So that's a structure that sits between the cortex and the amygdala. And it's the structure, it's like a little bridge, and it's called the power of the pause. When that particular structure works in a regulated way, it allows you to hold space for your emotions. It stops you from being impulsive. It's the home of self-regulation. Now, it receives a lot of its data from the locus coeruleus. Okay? So the novelty will come to the cingulate gyrus, and the cingulate gyrus, who's wiser than the locus coeruleus, says, you know what? It's okay. Just pause for a minute and we'll figure out what this is. I'm going to send the message up to the cortex. And then the cortex will say, it's only your sheets. Go back to sleep. Okay? But people who are OCD, who ruminate, the cingulate gyrus can't put on the brake, because the dopamine levels, which I think that's the next slide. It is. The dopamine levels are insufficient for that structure to hold. Was that clear? Hopefully that was helpful.
Mm-hmm. There are a few more questions that are private, but I think I know the answer to this one. I'm going to guess the answer is yes. The question is, when people have a tumor in their GI tract and they need to remove part of their gut, like would those people suffer from chronic sleep problems after the surgery?
Possibly. I'm thinking about a young man that I know who had a tumor in his gut. And there is a challenge dependent on where the tumor was, because the majority of the serotonin production in the gut is in the upper GI system, not the lower GI system. That's very, very interesting question. Gosh, this is a really fun conversation.
Wow, there's another question here. We had turkey for
Yep,
turkey for lunch, and that makes serotonin, right?
it makes tryptophan. And tryptophan is a precursor to serotonin. There's a lot of 5-HTP in, and that's why, but tryptophan, we're going to talk about this in number 3. I did a lot of research on this, is carried by carbs. So tryptophan by itself, your turkey dinner and your mashed potatoes together is what makes you tired, not just the turkey. Because there are other amino acids that block the tryptophan from reaching the brain, but carbs carry it across the bridge like a little boat ferry. So when you eat a lot of carbohydrates with your turkey, then you're going to be tired.
So turkey, mashed potatoes, and a glass of wine, you're really going to go to sleep.
Yes, sir.
So here's the question. We all know there are some foods that provide the amino acids for producing serotonin or tryptophan. Are there foods that interact with the serotonin production process and deter serotonin production?
I don't know the answer to that question.
We can research it.
Yep.
I'm taking note.
You know, that's something I will have to think about. All right, I want to talk about dopamine here for a second and REM. Because when you are in REM, what's fascinating about it is that your muscles are paralyzed and your dopamine levels are so high, it's like hallucinating. There were a lot of authors who compared REM sleep to schizophrenic hallucinations, to psychotic states. The brainwave activity is similar. There's a lot of dysregulation, high levels of endogenous output. And this is the dopamine levels are very high when you are in REM sleep. But thank goodness your muscles are paralyzed, or you would do all kinds of weird things in your sleep. You'd break things, you'd hit the person in the bed beside you. You would act out what you are dreaming. So I know that some of you might think about sleepwalking. There is a lot of these things are not proven yet, but there's a lot of conversation that dopamine levels are too high when you are in a sleepwalking state, that you're actually in that REM phase and you're not atonic enough in your muscles, and the dopamine levels are really high. And this is an interesting thing when you think about people with ADHD, because they have a lot of difficulty with dopamine, as do people with Parkinson's. So this is a phase in the literature of ADHD literature. REM is a problem. The REM phases seem to be longer, and the non-REM phases seem to be shorter in kids with ADHD diagnosis, which means they don't get the rest that they need for memory, for executive functions. It's like a vicious cycle. Some of you may have watched the little YouTube clip that was posted in the advertisement of this series. And there was a little clip on ADHD and sleep. And it was like, what comes first, the sleep problem or the inattention? Because they feed off each other. The more dysregulated your sleep rhythms, the more inattentive you are in the day. The more inattentive you are in the day, the more your sleep rhythms are dysregulated at night. And it just goes like a hamster wheel. So when I think about what OTs do with dopamine, we think about heavy work, moving your body against resistance. We'll talk about exercise, that you certainly might not want to have a piece of dark chocolate just before you go to bed, because it will increase your dopamine levels, as an example.
Kim, there's a question out of Australia.
Good.
What are the long-term impacts on Ritalin? The long-term impacts of Ritalin on dopamine levels and sleep?
Well, here's the cool thing. I can actually answer this one. It makes me proud of myself here. The interesting thing about Ritalin is it has a short half-life, which means that you take it and it goes into the brain, it's sucked up by the little receptor sites, and then it's gone. The thing that when kids are taking their Ritalin, one of the number one side effects is they have trouble falling asleep. Number one, they lose their appetite and they can't sleep. But the long-term ramifications don't seem to be impactful, because that's the interesting thing about Ritalin, is it just falls out of your brain. Your dopamine receptors are rapid adapters. Addiction, because that's all about dopamine, and they rapidly adapt, and you always want more of it. You will always want more dopamine. Your brain will never be happy with what you have. Cool? I have to do a check-in here. Everybody okay? Is this doing what you're hoping it's going to do? Yeah? Okay.
One thing that's pretty neat, Kim, I'm looking at the time. It's almost half over already, and you're at slide 12. So I don't know if you want to speak or if people want
it's not
questions answered.
it's what's interesting about the questions is many of the questions are weaving the future. It's not like, they have already seen this information, and we're kind of pulling it together in a way. I'm hoping. If I had to pick a book, and there were so many, The Science of Sleep by Wallace Mendelson is my recommendation. This is a very intense book to read, but it gives you all the neuroscience in one place. And he talks a lot about acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter we don't think a lot about unless you're thinking about movement, because it is the neurochemical of motor activation. But there's a lot of it in the cortex, and a lot of it in the reticular activating system. And it has a lot to do with how your body moves in your sleep, because we need to be able to change positions in our sleep. You wouldn't, if your acetylcholine levels are out of sync, then you are going to be the kind of person that does not roll over, that does not shift in their sleep. And this made me scared a wee bit, because this is me. And there's a lot of connection between this neurotransmitter and dementia. So there's a lot of drops in acetylcholine levels, because it's cortical and motor function based, especially in frontal cortex dementias. And as you start to see that neurotransmitter shift in its availability, you start to see the phenomenon we call sundowning in dementia patients, where they start to get agitated and their body starts restless legs, their hands start moving, they start wandering. This is acetylcholine. So
this-
go ahead, Bob.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you like that, but the science of sleep, I was trying to type it in, but I can't remember the author's name.
Well, it's on the slide there at the bottom, and it says Wallace Mendelson.
Thank you very much. While I've got you, what does supplemental melatonin use do to the body's longer-term manufacture of required amounts of melatonin?
There was no way we would get away from that question in this workshop. That was the one I was waiting for, because that is the most common question asked of every naturopath. Because there is a belief that if you take exogenous melatonin, that it will change your own endogenous production of it. And the jury is out on that. That is not consistently true. I read over 25 papers, and it was not clear that taking melatonin from outside of you stops you from producing your own. It's very much more at a genetic level. Your melatonin production, your own melatonin production, really is driven by your own genes. Some people need melatonin like insulin. And they say that in all the literature. That's for some of our kids, I read this in paper after paper, and you see this on the net when there are so many parent groups that talk about sleep, you can only imagine. And many, many parents will say, you know, my kid took melatonin for 6 years. They went off the melatonin and they stopped functioning. And we went back on the melatonin, and now we're back to having a restful sleep. So again, it's each person's prescription. You could become a sleep OT. That could be your whole function. Looking at people's individualized sleep processes. Go ahead, Bob. I'm watching your face there.
I was just letting in a new participant. Welcome.
Cool. So the purpose of REM is really a mystery. You know, Freud and Jung, they really, really were very focused on REM as an aspect of a way of our brain working through our emotional life. That things that we can't hold in our day, this is a safe place for that to happen in our dreams. So, you know, that's a theory that still holds to today, that we're working out our information. I don't even want to call it unconscious, our subconscious mysteries of our activating points in our trauma life in this chapter of our sleep. And here during REM, our muscles actually let go. This is where muscle repair happens, by the way. So, you know, when you think about having an injury, or if you work in orthopedics, this is a muscle repair phase. And you typically enter REM, you know, Jenny, this is the word, typically enter REM about 90 minutes after you fall asleep. But the first cycle is usually very short. Your first little cycle of REM is usually 20 to 30 minutes, and they get longer across the night. In ultimate sleep, you should be in a REM phase just before you wake up. So the scenario I described Bob in this morning when he was dreaming about going to Sleep Country Canada, he was not close to being ready to wake up. So if he had slept naturally without the alarm going off, there would have been another phase. And this is a challenge because many of us get up because we have to get up, and we're not actually following the phase of our sleep that would be most beneficial to our function. especially teenagers who fall asleep, whose brains produce melatonin much later. And their phases are 2 hours later in relationship to children younger than them and adults.
More awesome questions.
Great.
Many families who use the Safe and Sound protocol report increased vivid dreams when
Yes.
listening to this. Can you explore how this shift into parasympathetic contributes to more REM intense dreams?
I want to know who asked that brilliant question.
That's Artina.
That is a brilliant question. So what happens is when you hit safety, that's when you can actually do your work. You know how they always say you will only work on your inner work when you are safe enough to do that. So when the parasympathetic state is in a balanced enough, is your neuroception is balanced enough, your brain and your body can hold it so that you can tolerate and start to consolidate and reorganize. That is a really cool question. Thank you for asking that question. And so anything that puts us into parasympathetic, this is what happens to so many of my trauma survivors, is as they start to get better, they dream more, and it's scary. And they need support to know that they're not getting worse. They're actually working it out in that space. Love that question.
There's another one. I'm not sure I understand perfectly. Can you explain what happened during nocturnal enuresis?
Yes.
Parents have difficulty in waking kids with this condition to go to the toilet, and they try hard to do so. What's going on?
Bobby, you must be so happy that question got asked.
I have to disclose, when we went through all the PowerPoints, I'm like, Kim, what about wetting the bed? We've got to talk about wetting the bed. Everyone does it, or everyone knows someone who's done it. We have to understand it. So I'm actually really glad this question came up. Yes.
So there is a great website, and I'm going to talk a lot about this I'm going to pull it up just to remind myself. And it's called bedwettingtherapy.com. And the name of the device is called Therapy. Therapy. And this is a fantastic website that talks about, I had it ready because I was hoping that question would come up, talks about the neurobiology of what happens during bedwetting and how there is a genetic component to it, which is really interesting. It is 2-to-1 males and very much a part of the genetic configuration. And the other piece that happens is that it typically happens during non-REM sleep, when you are actually so deep asleep that you disconnect from your own body. And then, if you remember the atonic phase of REM, when all your muscles shut down, as you age, meaning after you're about 2, your bladder will keep its tone, unless it doesn't. And when you get to be, 55, you go back there and your bladder loses its tone when you're sleeping. So you see that happen at both ends of the lifespan, where in those shifts between REM, non-REM and REM, and the muscle changes, then you start to see bedwetting happen as part of those transitions. It's a process of maturity. It's a developmental process. See how each one of these things could be its own workshop? Oh my God.
Yeah, and I know we're going to be talking about that in strategies. How can we prevent or clean up, monitor?
Yes, promise. It's
Yeah.
coming. But just in case you're excited, and you really want that answer right now, you can have a look at that website.
Yeah, bedwetting.com, right?
Yeah.
Okay, one more question. What lengthens the REM stage over the night? Does it mean if someone has broken sleep that they only get short REM stages as they always have to
Oh,
pause again?
yes. And oh man, can I talk about this with menopause? One of the challenges with REM is that your natural temperature rises. Because there's so much dopamine, your temperature goes up, your heart rate goes up, your sympathetic nervous system goes up. And so for menopausal women whose hypothalamus no longer has that estrogen in it, which is very interesting because estrogen and serotonin have a very similar molecular configuration. So this also applies to PMS, for example. If I've got an estrogen molecule floating by, all of my serotonin receptors will say, I'll take that. That's good enough. I'll take it. And they suck up the estrogen and the serotonin receptors go, ah. And as the estrogen starts to fall out of your brain, those serotonin receptors go like this. I don't like that. And then the melatonin production decreases. So you see, that's that chronic problem with women who are menopausal with sleep. Sleep is one of the plates of menopause. And as soon as they hit REM, that's when the hot flashes tend to happen. Because the core temperature goes up and then they wake up and that REM phase is shortened. So, that's where when we get to strategies, we talk about things like making sure the temperature of the room is cool is very important. And a dilemma if you need a weighted blanket and cool at the same time. Right?
Another good question here. In the PowerPoints, it was written that bedwetting, getting back to that topic, could be a sign of dysfunction in the corpus callosum. Can you say more about the corpus callosum and bedwetting?
Sure. So when you think about the corpus callosum, it has so many jobs. I'm just thinking about, Sarah, exactly what I said there. So hang on a second. And the reason I want to say that is because the corpus callosum is so interesting in its role of creating connection between the two hemispheres. And if you think about in that first PowerPoint, the very last slides, I'm just going to go there because such an fascinating learning for me from a lady named Severn Fisher. And I learned about this during a trauma course. So Severn Fisher is a neurofeedback expert in the field of fear. And she found that when there was overstimulation in one hemisphere versus the other, there were different functions that were affected in sleep. And so here, under arousal, I wanted to go back there. Under arousal and under reactive left hemisphere. When the left hemisphere doesn't have enough activation, okay, then you see what I just described. There is this night sweats, frequent waking without agitation, light sleep, sleeps too much. This is called low arousal. Sleep apnea is connected to low arousal. Snoring. Snoring has a lot to do with the arousal level of the muscles in the back of the throat. not rested after sleep, and very difficulty shutting down that thinking brain. But this is the low arousal brain. And you see this pattern very commonly in depression. She then saw, right here, this is where you saw it, Sarah, the bridge between the two hemispheres. And this is in psychiatry, that corpus callosum helps integrate thoughts and feelings. So the left hemisphere's job is to quieten the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere's job is to say, it's okay, and make sense out of life. When the corpus callosum is thin, or when the information flow between the two hemispheres is poor, what you see is clients who shift between thinking and feeling. They cannot think and feel. So they're either all in their head, dismissing their feelings, or all in their feelings with no rational thought. An example would be somebody who might present with a borderline personality disorder. And what she found was she looked at people, Sebern Fisher looked at people with this psychiatric presentation and found these associated sleep-related issues. And by the way, sleep dysregulation in children is a very high predictor of neurodiversity and future mental health concerns. Okay, it's a very, very high predictor. If you look at conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, attention deficit disorder, how many Ds can we say? Sleep in early childhood, before preschool, was almost always a challenge. So Sebern Fisher talks a lot about wanting to correct using neurofeedback, which you'll hear about next week, as a way of creating this brainwave synchrony between the two hemispheres so that the thoughts and the feelings can come together. And this is one of the places where she sees the greatest amount of change in function is in these parameters of sleep. So she might be treating, I loved this chapter in her book, she was treating the psychiatric problem and these functions changed first. So she started to use sleep measures as a measure of mental health change. Isn't that cool?
This is fascinating. There's a question that relates this to sleep across the lifespan. And I think everyone can appreciate that co-regulation and feeling emotionally safe is what we need to sleep well. But question is, when people aren't getting that co-regulation and they're not feeling safe, are there, when that's absent and that prevents good sleep, is it especially sensitive during key developmental windows?
Definitely. I mean, the part, I'm going to give you a warning. See how I just leaned into the camera? The part that you're going to hear about that I struggled the most, I'm just going to give you a warning, is about back to sleep and cry it out sleep and the Ferber method. I know that everyone wants to know about that. Sleep training, conditioned responses. This is the part of the research that was the most intense for me, because there is so much literature, I'll just tell you, that says that stress, and it's hard because so many of us are moms. We're not just therapists, we're also moms. That letting kids struggle outside of their window of tolerance in the transition to sleep is a very significant dysregulator for the brain. I think that's what you were asking in that question.
I mean, that's such a sensitive topic because I know people have different opinions and experiences, but what teenagers or other developmental windows when the brain is really pruning or changing?
Well, you know, anytime the brain, but remember, co-regulation in the daytime carries over into co-regulation at night. This is a big, important thing I just said. You will have, if you feel supported and loved and connected and safe in your world, you don't actually need people to be there physically as you age and develop across time, because you carry those people with you in your being. That's what the sleep separation transition is all about. And so teenagers, as an example, if they're relationally in a fairly secure space during their day, then their need for that at sleep time will not be such a big deal. We always want security when we feel the least safe. Is that okay, Bob?
Yeah, it's just like a lot of us, I think we're all reflecting on, man, I wish we knew this information when, our kids were little, or like, I wish I knew this 40 years ago, because sleep is so important. So I'm just reflecting on all of these questions. And again, I want to say thank you to the Hong Kong Sensory Integration Society for coming up with this topic. It's the first time I've really looked into this myself. So thank you for the topic.
And you can see how we could talk about this for a month, right? There's so much to say. So Jonathan just asked, what is the relationship between sleep disorder and schizophrenia? Schizophrenia is predominantly a disorder of dysregulated dopamine. So if I go back here to this chart and you look at dopamine, it promotes waking. If it's very, very high, it makes it very difficult to sleep. So there is a challenge with that whole sense of quality of sleep, because dopamine also accentuates the REM phase and the capacity to have a deep enough sleep, because when dopamine is high, serotonin is typically low. When dopamine is high, GABA is low. So they have inverse relationships with each other, typically. So you won't see a qualitative sleep, which you probably could have said that yourself. Melissa, thank you for asking a question. How do melatonin supplements impact sleep and circadian rhythms in children with ASD? Typically, they're helpful. When you think about, and I'm going to talk about this next week, that melatonin in kids with ASD actually are processed if you're finding some that when they take their supplement that they may have benefit with the onset, but then they wake up, that speaks to their circadian rhythm genetics, that it is more than just their melatonin production. See, if you're taking melatonin and it's working for you, that speaks to your serotonin-melatonin relationship. So it's kind of like when it works its treatment, you're uncovering with a detective process But if I take melatonin, when I take melatonin, when I have jet lag, I hallucinate. Like I don't even know where I am. My dad used to do that too when he took melatonin. That means that my serotonin, melatonin levels are already really high. That I'm just making it, I'm making it more chaotic in my own nervous system. So it speaks to what sits underneath that issue. So if you've got kids that are falling asleep with the melatonin but don't stay asleep, that speaks to their serotonin, melatonin relationships. So would you say that kids who have night terrors after melatonin have? Yes. Yes. And dopamine. I mean, that those relate, that those three chemicals, Sarah, of serotonin, melatonin, and dopamine will be high. And what happens when that happens is it causes an intrinsic release of adrenaline. That's why we call it a night terror. Because then you have fear with those chemicals. Such great questions. Whew, does anyone need to go to the bathroom? Feel free. See if there's anything else I really want to make sure you. Oh, I thought this was very interesting. How the eyes move under the lids. Do you know that they do that in fetal development? When you do a 4D ultrasound on a fetus, you can already see REM happening. Isn't that cool? So even babies are having that experience. Now, they don't have it a lot because preemies have a very low level of REM, but you still see it emerging in fetal development. Hey, Melissa, were you going to ask me something? Did I cut you? Are you cool? Okay. I'm really watching those of you who are with me here. Hey, Bob, how's it going?
It's going good. I'm curious if we're going to have time to get to the sleep through the life stages and anything from different ages. I know menopause is a total mystery to a lot of people, but if you wanted to go to some of those slides, I'd be interested to hear more.
I mean, I can do anything. I'm kind of going because I liked, if you can just ask me questions randomly, there's no need for that level of structure for me as well.
Okay, so just off the top of your head, why is menopause so hard and how does it impact sleep?
Well, as I just said, I think I spoke a lot a few moments ago around the loss of estrogen and how that impacts the structure of the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is where your melatonin is made. The pineal gland and the hypothalamus have this beautiful relationship, creating the circadian rhythms. And your hypothalamus is very sensitive to light. When you think about, the impact, we all know that light has an impact on melatonin production. They say, I feel like the jet lag queen, that when you fly to, a different time zone, that you should get outside in the sun, because that will help shift your circadian rhythm. And it's your hypothalamus that picks that information up. So, Bob, in the hypothalamus, it regulates your temperature, it regulates your hunger, it regulates your drowsiness and your sleep rhythms, and it regulates your sexual response. Those four things are all at home in the hypothalamus. If you change one of those things, you change them all. So if you impact, sleep, you get hunger, and all four of those structures, functions, they get sides, like I call it hijacked. And so estrogen, there's so many estrogen receptors in the hypothalamus because the cycle of your menses is a cycle. So that's part of the hypothalamus's job, is the rhythms of the body. So now that estrogen goes away, and all of those functions, hunger, sexual desire, sleep, regulation, they all are hijacked by a change in that chemistry.
I just see a question that I know people are already getting to. So what do we do? Solutions and sensory integration, or
Oh,
I know that we have to wait, right?
you do? Yeah, I mean, that's you're getting me ready for the next part of the series.
But a reminder, if anyone does want to write questions about solutions for the next couple
Or
sessions,
desires for solutions.
please, you can write those into the notes, and we're going to have a history of the chats. So Kim will be able to go and make sure all of those are included in the slides. But I know for discussion today, let's not just get to the solutions just yet, but still ask the questions for next time.
Great. A kid in the preschool that I'm working with always falls asleep in the day but stays awake at night. Persists throughout his life after about a year old. This is definitely a circadian rhythm problem. And I would bet that if you Google circadian genes, you will see that that is a very typical presentation of a genetic configuration that alters that rhythm. And of course, you're going to want to know what to do. That would be complex unwrap of looking at all of. In North America, we have a thing called the Dutch test, which is a typically done by either a functional medicine physician or a naturopath. And it's a urine analysis that looks at every single one of your neurotransmitters and your entire hormone panel across time. And it also looks at how you methylize your neurotransmitters through your urine, and also how you're methylizing and cleaning up your hormones through your liver. So it would, that would be the kind of kid that I would want to have that kind of panel. Because I don't know that I would know what to do until I knew what the chemistry was doing. Sarah, why would you not be able to fall asleep if woken up in the middle of the night? Oh, there's so many reasons. Anxiety, that imbalance that Severn Fisher talks about between the right and the left hemisphere, if there's an underlying imbalance in that flow of information between the two sides of the brain, then when you're awake in the middle of the night, that flow will really be prominent, because it takes a lot of neural, if I've got a dominant left brain or a dominant right brain or an imbalanced harmony between the two sides, when I have been asleep and I wake up, those brainwave patterns that are part of the sleep cycle, they are going to be exaggerated as a dysfunction when I wake up. So I'm going to spin in my head and ruminate about stuff that I shouldn't be thinking about. Especially if I'm right brain dominant. And that comes back to developmental trauma, because the right brain is the home of inhibition of the amygdala. And so we see people with too much activity on the right side of the brain having all of this anxiety and it shows up almost 100% of the time in the middle of the night. Does that answer your question, Sarah? Cool.
Kim, there are two questions that are really closely related.
Yes.
Seem really important. There are some people who sleep more during the day, really can't sleep at night, and it messes them up sometimes. Little kids, sometimes older people. Can you just speak to what contributes to that kind of pattern?
Well, you know, if we talk about, for example, narcolepsy, which, by the way, has been determined. I'm just thinking, does everybody know what I mean when I talk about narcolepsy? That's falling asleep in the middle of nowhere, meaning I just cannot stay awake no matter what. You know, that's really been perceived, it's been determined to be an autoimmune disorder, which is very new information. There is an actual hormone in the brain called orexin. It's also produced in the hypothalamus. And they found that there's an immune response to this hormone for some reason. And when there's active inflammatory processes in the body, you know, when there's loads of stress, allergy, all these pieces, then it's going to have an autoimmune impact on this hormone and you won't be able to stay awake. So there is a relationship between inflammation and wakefulness and sleeping. And by the way, autism spectrum disorder is considered an autoimmune disorder. So levels of arousal of wakefulness and sleep are impacted whenever there's active inflammatory processes going on somewhere in the body. That was such a great question. I saw the question about bruxism. And you know what, Tina? There's actually a bruxism place in the brain. Isn't that bizarre? There's a bruxism center in the brain, and it's identifiable in EEG monitoring. So, and maybe, you know, Karen could even tell me more about this. I'll have to ask her because she took a neurofeedback course. But neurofeedback practitioners treat this center because there's a strong connection between teeth grinding and low arousal. There's different kinds of bruxism. There's bruxism for the purposes of release of anxiety, and there's bruxism that happens in attempt to open the airway. So I have to know from the brainwave activity, what kind of teeth grinding have I got going on here? Because not every tooth grinder is grinding their teeth because they're anxious. If I'm struggling to open my airway because I'm low arousal in my, remember that low arousal left brain is highly connected to sleep apnea, where I stop breathing for periods of time, and the muscles in my esophagus, they become atonic, and then I can't breathe. I may grind my teeth to try and open up that airway. That was a cool, and should we refer for a sleep study? I mean, the thing in reality is I think we could all have a sleep study. And I don't think the sleep study people would like that. But I do think, you know, when you hear, there are some low-tech devices that you're going to hear about in the next chapter that are sort of a pre-screen. How's that? That would be helpful before we actually go that distance, because having a sleep study sucks. Getting all hooked up and trying to sleep in a lab. It's not a very fun experience. So there are other more low-tech ways to get there before I go that far in my thought process.
Kim, there's a question that I bet you everyone might be wondering. About gender, other than menopause, you said there were some differences. Are there any differences between men and women throughout the lifespan with gender and sleep?
Yes, some of it has to do with the prostate and bladder.
Okay, say more about.
So for men, even without prostate cancer, the prostate changes across the lifespan in men, and it takes up more space in a sense and presses on the bladder and causes men to have to wake up and pee in the middle of the night. So one of the functions that happens, especially for men, not necessarily whenever middle age happens, I'm not even sure what middle age is anymore or what is elderly anymore. You know, the whole world of longevity, I'm starting to see 60 as middle age. It just depends on what is going on in your individual situation. But yes, there is a lot of evidence that men have more difficulty with bladder earlier than women, and that causes awakening in the nighttime.
I'm just guessing that little boys pee in the bed more than little girls.
Yes, correct. It's a genetic configuration. The other thing about boys, men, is they have a thinner corpus callosum. Many of you have heard me talk about trauma and attachment, that I often say, you know, self-regulation doesn't really happen until you're 25 years old if you're female, and 30 if you're male. And that's because for the male brain, the corpus callosum is thinner. That bridge between the two hemispheres is thinner. And so the flow of data between the two sides of the brain, if we go back to that slide, if you go back to that slide at the end, when we looked at the two hemispheres, and you saw bedwetting, when the corpus callosum is thin, that's part of the reason, Bob. Corpus callosum, and that flow between the two hemispheres is part of the necessity of keeping the brain and the body in a connected state.
Okay. So there wouldn't be any generalities about men needing more sleep or less sleep, or the whole question of the length of sleep. That's nothing to do with genders?
Nope.
Okay.
It says individualized as each individual person.
Okay. And what about the length of sleep in general? Can you comment on the number of hours we need, or it's really quite individual, right?
Well, you know, there are generalities that, okay, if we look at, for example, right here, let me back up a second. So let's talk about newborns. And actually, let's back up here and talk about preemies. Very young preemies don't move as much or have as much REM as older preemies. And young preemies spend most of their time in very light sleep. And at term, preemies still do not have as much deep sleep as full-term babies. So right from the beginning, our preemies the stage is set for them to have a different sleep pattern. Think about all the 9 million kids that I know that were in the ICU, who are now adults who still have trouble sleeping. That this is and because the NICU environment, there's a lot of controversy about the NICU environment is about survival. But now, when I worked in the NICU in the 80s, the lights were on all the time, the bells were ringing all the time. There was special lamps inside the isolette. We would never do this now, because that stimulation has been shown to create too much stress for that very sensitive nervous system. So newborns, they stay awake for 2 to 3 hours at a time, typically, and most of their sleep is for between 45 minutes and 3 to 4 hours, and then they eat and they go back to sleep, and they eat and they go back to sleep. And why they do that is because they are growing, and the need for sleep is very high because of the metabolic energy needed for them to prune their brain. Babies, by the time they're 4 months old, they spend twice as long sleeping during the night as during the day. And by 6 months, they might sleep through the night. But this is when separation anxiety begins, which may affect sleep at this age. And 50% of a baby's sleep is in REM. That's really high. Isn't that interesting? The rest of their sleep is in deep restorative non-REM, but they don't have the same amount of muscle atonia because they can't run away. They can't fight, they can't flight. So they don't have this, they move. Babies move a lot in their sleep because they don't have the same amount of paralysis as we do. You don't really have that atonia until age 1. So there's a lot of interest about REM sleep in babies being 50%, because why would you need that? It's got a lot to do, they think, with the organization of the psyche and the structure of the identity in the attachment. Because what we see in kids with developmental trauma is a higher percentage of REM sleep. That they have a higher percentage, infants, and they have a higher percentage of sleep dysregulation. So I said this already, not always, but dysregulation related to the phases of sleep in infancy is often a predictor of future mental health or developmental neurodiversity. That's a 2020 paper. By the way, you will have my reference list at the end, okay? When I'm all done, because I keep changing it, you will have it at the end. So remember, developmental trauma has a tremendous impact on sleep. Almost every kiddo who has a developmental trauma history has a sleep dysregulation pattern. And I'm talking about chaos, addiction, abuse, neglect, not small. If there's a majority of one's time that is in a space of security, that's on the continuum of security. But if the majority of my time is in a situation of dysregulation in relationship, I'm going to have a greater degree of dysregulation in my sleep. I talk about the default mode network in the brain. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. And you've already been listening to me for too long. So this is a big topic to bring up at 10 minutes before we're going to be done. But the default mode network is a circuit in the brain that goes between the frontal, temporal, and parietal. And it's the place of mind wandering, of creativity, of mindfulness, of meditation. This is the ultimate health in the brain. When the default mode network is on and the salience network of threat is off, you're going to have a greater capacity for executive functions. And the problem with trauma is that it absolutely disrupts this default mode network. And it allows the salience brain to be on all the time. And that rest, mind wandering, reflective, introspective state doesn't develop. And that's initiated in the right orbital frontal cortex. And the right orbital frontal cortex is the home of inhibition that allows you to feel safe in your body. So if I have trauma and this part of my brain didn't develop or is altered from my trauma, I will not ever feel safe in my brain, in my body. And it won't allow me to shift into that state of true rest. So it's very significant for mental health and sleep.
Wow. Speaking of trauma, a client with anxiety disorder was saying that he had a hallucinatory experience of dissociating from his own body and watching himself while he was sleeping. He also had rumination of negative thoughts. Is this common, and is this related to sleep apnea? Can you comment on?
It actually can be. So that feeling of watching yourself from the ceiling, it's called sleep paralysis. And it's a phenomenon that happens in that hypnagogic state where you're awake, but you're not really awake and you're paralyzed. It's a horrible feeling. Or you feel like you're suffocating, or you see yourself from above yourself. And this is very, again, there's high adrenaline, high dopamine. So the body, the brain is not falling into that space of rest and relax. So in that question, yes, it is very common to have sleep paralysis with anxiety. Sleep paralysis causes anxiety for many. So it's kind of like this dance. And it is correlated with sleep apnea because many people with sleep apnea feel like they're suffocating. How about, how are you doing there? Are we?
A whole pile of questions that I'm holding back. I realize we only have about 8 minutes. Can
So how about
a few of them?
just keep going, and I'm just gonna turn off the slides and just answer questions.
Great. And a reminder to everyone, if you have specific questions about solutions, you can put them also in the chat or send them just to me, and then we'll make sure that those are answered. Okay, really quick question. Does sleep need to be continuous and achieve a certain length? If so, what length? I think that's really the question. And what happens when it's broken at different stages? But how long do people really need, and does it have to be continuous?
There is a lot of conversation around quality versus quantity. That the quality of the sleep, and that's your resting heart rate variability, what your breathing is doing while you're sleeping, your brainwave. If you had a sleep study, they would look at all of those things. What's happening with the brainwave activity, what's happening with your heart rate variability, which your heart rate variability speaks to your parasympathetic capacity to regulate you into a restful state. And they would also monitor your O2 sats and your respiration rate. Those are all the variables. And you're going to hear about aura, a ring, for example, that measures those functions while you're sleeping. And qualitatively, you might sleep for 14 hours and really only have like 3 hours of quality sleep. And then you wake up and you feel crappy. So quality is more important than quantity.
Yeah, okay, there's another question just about that. When people are hyper aroused all day and over alert, even though they're fatigued and they've had insomnia the night before, it's just an awful situation. It's painful for people to be so stressed up, but they can't sleep. Is that related to a neurotransmitter imbalance?
Oh yeah, baby. As a matter of fact, you've just described ADHD. It's high levels of cortisol makes you tired and wired. When your cortisol levels are high and they don't, and here's the thing about that. You need that deep sleep to clean up. Remember I talked about the washing machine of the brain? You actually clean up like little enzymes in a scrub brush, the cells between the cells of the brain. And that happens in that very deep sleep. And that takes the cortisol out so that you've actually de-stressed yourself during sleep. And so if I can't do that, then I'm tired, but I'm also wired. And this is what we see in a lot of our kids with neurodiversity. Their hyperactivity is actually not a form of seeking. It's a form of stress. It's a very powerful concept. So tired and wired. And that means I have to have a greater degree. Well, I'm getting into solutions. Stay tuned.
Okay, quick question about the length of time that people need. I think you kind of said, is it 7-8 hours in general? Neurologically?
7 to 8 hours is optimum and recommended because of the phases of sleep that can be accomplished in that duration. But there are some people that accomplish those same phases of sleep in 6 hours. And some people need 9. So it's generally 8 hours, but not necessarily. It's more about the phases of sleep and the quality within those phases of sleep.
Really weird study. I studied history in university, not OT. I wasn't so lucky to even know OT existed back then. But what I learned in history about sleep was one commonality. The study was done on the past 10 presidents of the United States, and one thing they had in common is that they function very highly with very little sleep. Bill Clinton, as an example, never needed more than 5 or 6 hours of sleep, and he could function perfectly. Whereas people like me will never be president, never probably want to be, because I need more, like 8-9 hours a night. But think of the advantages if you don't need sleep as much as others.
Well, some people, ironically, use adrenaline to think. So it's not, I don't actually believe that it'll get them in the long run, is what I guess I want to say.
Okay. Even if you need the sleep is good for you. Correct.
That you can do that for a while, but you can do that for a while, but in the end, it'll get you.
Is there any connection between the sleep-wake homeostasis and circadian rhythms?
Yeah, to me, they are the same thing.
A connection between the sleep-wake homeostasis and circadian.
Sorry.
That was Siri. Maybe Siri would like to answer that question for me.
I woke up Siri. Sorry.
Karen Wong, can you type in there in the chat the name of the ring? Would you mind doing that for me? I want to make sure the spelling is right. Sarah Mulholland just asked that question. Cool. All right. Wow, you guys. Yes, the Oura ring and the Whoop. And we are going to talk about those. Well, 73 people who came for this conversation. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Melissa, you're in the dark. We are in the dark, and day is just beginning over where you are for many of you. So I hope this was a useful conversation. Please bring more questions to our next Q&A. And please write in there in the next few minutes. What do you want to know? What do you want to know more about from the perspective of solutions? So as I prepare, I have in my head what you're interested in.
And I should comment on the process to get the recording for this session. It might
Okay.
take a week, just because our editor's been working full time around the clock and he's a little bit behind. But as soon as he can record, so he can edit this, we're going to be also hosting it on Thinkific, and you'll receive an email from Thinkific when it's ready. And thanks for your patience with that.
And the next Q&A session is the same Zoom link as this one. So you will not receive a new invite. I mean, you might receive a reminder,
It would be good to receive a reminder.
but it will be the same one.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone, come on. You can type away what you want to know.
I think they've already been typing a whole bunch. I've seen at least 10 questions, some of them
Okay,
privately, but there are lots.
great.
Yeah.
All right. Have a magnificent day. And thanks for joining us. Thank you.
And thank you to Jenny, and thank you to the Hong Kong Sensory Integration Society for
Mm.
putting this together. And
And thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Kim, and thank you, Bob, for joining us in this amazing Zoom talk. And it's very rich and a lot of information. I think all of us need to process, needs a lot of time to process and, revise the videos and notes. And we are all looking forward for the coming videos and the next Zoom. So yeah, thank you very much.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned.
Take care.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Love it. Bye, Leith.
oh, I'm finally putting it on gallery view. I can see your faces. It's nice to see you.
It's nice to see you, Alice. Beautiful to see you.
Hi.
How are you?
Good.
Good.
Thank you so much. Thank you
Thank you.
so much. This way is very good. Actually, I've been rewinding. Every single sentence is useful.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
That's
this
great.
mode is really good.
Good.
Yeah, because I won't get so lost. I mean, having rewinded your two sessions a few times to make sure that I get the points, and then listening to you again, and then listening to all the question and answer. Very good. We should
Thank
do
you.
more of that.
Thank you.
Works for you.
Yeah, that's good encouragement. Bless you.
Right.
Cool.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm leaving now.
Me too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.